We can get started.
Great,
Yeah, I think
fantastic.
there are people who want to chip in, but
Okay, cool. So I thought that because Nelson Goodman as a philosopher has this quality that I quite like, and it's really quite distinctive of him, is that he has this kind of very unfussy, kind of direct way of sort of setting up a problem and sort of posing a problem. It's not really much of a preamble. He just goes right in and says, this is what we're going to be doing. I mean, he even goes so far as to have the decency to have a section of the chapter actually just simply called, like, the answer. So he's kind of so plain dealing that he says, this is the question, I'm setting it up, and this is the answer. This is actually an excerpt from a chapter from a book by Goodman called Languages of Art, but it's striking that in a way some of the points that he's making in this part of the book are really very self-standing and provocative, and one can have an entire discussion just kind of at this stage in what he's thinking about without presupposing too much of what he's eventually going on to say, right? So I thought that what we could do is we could sort of divide the discussion a bit up between, because we usually break in the middle briefly, so because it sort of falls neatly into these two sections, a first section that poses this one kind of problem about authenticity, which is sort of the relationship between these kind of perfectly indiscriminable original and fake, and then this like second reflection, which is about sort of what types of artwork are even possible to fake. I thought that we could spend the time up until the snack moment, the break, talking about the first question, and then get into the second question for the second part of the discussion. And I thought that we could sort of just kind of go through collectively together and just kind of reconstruct what it is that Goodman's thinking. So at the very start of the chapter, he raises this, what he calls an acute theoretical problem that he's going to contrast with, and that he says is in some sense relevant to this practical problem that a curator or that an art historian or that an art collector, as Goodman himself was an art collector, would face. And what do we think that acute theoretical problem is? What is the acute theoretical problem that he thinks is going on that's distinct from this practical problem that's faced by the people that are actually dealing in the art?
Well, it has to do with reason and with logic, I think, more than it does with aesthetics.
That's interesting.
How we observe things and how these the persistence of truth, whether truth persists, and how to identify truth's value.
Well, you said something at the very start there about this problem about perception. And I was wondering, in connection to that, if one thing that we could sort of put on the table right at the start of the discussion is that it seems clear that that Goodman is concerned with a sort of a much more general issue that's going on in the background, which is about perception, and yes, about how we reason about perception, and what kind of considerations about how the things that we're perceiving in the world actually are, as opposed to our ability to make certain distinctions or to discriminate in certain ways in perception. So I think that that's a really excellent way into this text, which is to say that Goodman is not narrowly concerned with the problem that he's posing here. So when he says there's this acute theoretical problem, I think there are at least two ways to read that. The first is that there's an acute theoretical problem about answering this question about what is aesthetically relevant, right? And the what is aesthetically relevant question is presumably the one that feeds directly into why there are even these people that are making, collections of our works, that are curating our works, that are paying for our works. And then, in a way, behind that acute theoretical problem that's directly about this question of aesthetic relevance, there are all these philosophical questions about perception and about the ways in which perception is going to track reality that are in the background. So that's a good place to start. Why should this acute theoretical problem matter to the art historian, the curator, the collector?
well, the book is called Languages of Art, right?
Mhm.
So it's the text as a whole speaks to what kind of information we receive and give through different forms of communication. So it's relevant to anybody that's interested in communicating with others, and in particular artists and people that are on the receiving end of that kind of discourse, right? So I think I know it falls out of the particular excerpt that this group is analyzing, but I think it's important to consider that Goodman was trying to distinguish what separates a form of notation from a language, and then what art and its aesthetic problems make it distinct from language. So the idea of something being authentic is all about what kind and what quality of information we receive from it. And in that sense, to a collector, it's an important part of appreciation and valuing a work of art. And to the layman, it speaks to a greater conversation and a greater system of communicating between human beings.
So what's the connection? What's the connection between, you use the term information. So let's think a minute about what is the kind of information that Goodman is talking about in this chapter? What are some pieces of information in this we're not going to think of that as a terribly loaded term for the moment. Let's just think about it as kind of like information in the way that I could ask you who your mother or father were, or information in the sense that I could ask you how do you get to Harlem?
What's the truth value of the information? Is it true or is it not true? Is it just fake information?
Well, that's relevant to the quality of the information, the character of the information. One could even wonder whether or not it even makes sense to talk about false information. What I'm curious about is, what is the relationship between the types of information that he's talking about in this chapter and the $1 million question? Well, one of the $2 million questions, which is what differences are aesthetically relevant? So what types of information bear on the question of
graphics and words and even spellings of words?
Specifically, the issue of what's aesthetically relevant about something being a fake versus an original. So just the question that he's asking in the first few pages.
Isn't that the problem? That if you're receiving the same information from both works, how do you value one? I mean, it can't strictly, that's the problem. If you're strictly focusing on your aesthetic reaction to both pieces, and the fake is so remarkably talented and has the same kind of genius, if we can call it that, then are you going to be able to distinguish between the two? So the information might be the same with both.
Good. So what kind of information is that information? That's information about...
In the case of the Cézanne, it comes through the texture of oil paint, his graphic arrangement, and there's a whole set of information regarding its provenance, where it was painted, who owned it.
Well, let's move a little bit more slowly, though, because what I'm trying to get at is, that's a very heterogeneous collection of things, right? And I could have information about, what kind of oils were used, and, like little Pantone color chips that you could show me and say, these are all of the colors that were used in the painting, and that would be one type of information. That's obviously a sense of information that's very different from the sense in which standing in front of the two at a certain distance, maybe in good lighting conditions, I have some kind of an information about the colors, the medium, things like that. So...
Does it have something to do with the aesthetic judgment?
Okay.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I'm sort of trying to raise here as a problem, which is that one might have sort of suspected that there was going to be some kind of a nicely sort of delimited space of the information that's given to you in perception, the information that's given to you by looking at something, as distinct from the kind of information that you could get by testimony, by somebody telling you, like, I did all of this research and I've determined this, or the kind of information that could be given to you by carbon dating, or the type of information that could be given to you by
Chemical analysis.
psychoanalysis? Chemical analysis.
That's a whole different.
Maybe psychoanalysis.
Chemical analysis, right. So one thing that seems to be very much on Goodman's mind in this chapter is whether or not it's possible for us to make sense of the idea that what is aesthetically relevant, or that there's some kind of criterion of aesthetic relevance that's going to make a distinction in a case where our information is merely looking. So our information is what we can get simply by observing them. And one way of reading the first section of this chapter is an attempt to undermine our sense that that we have a grip on what it is to be merely looking. Right. So that's one way of interpreting what's going on, is that it's a natural thought. So I think that one thing that I'd like us to do, at least somewhat, is maybe resist the drift of Goodman's thinking here, because he seems to be sort of thinking that that there's not really much to this idea of the sort of commonality between your experience of the one and your experience of the other, that being construed as a type of perceptual information about the qualities of the paintings. And I think that we need to be very careful in figuring out why he thinks that gives the wrong answer. Because it's very attractive. It's a very old answer, too. So I don't want to do a little sort of history lesson, but the discipline of aesthetics in philosophy, going back to the 18th century, aesthetics, aesthesis, it was supposed to be a theory of sensation. So our experience of things like the beautiful, our experience of things like the sublime, so these are supposed to be categories of things that we would undergo. And so this idea that you're somehow supposed to be challenging your experience as the ultimate authority of aesthetic relevance is actually a very peculiar and maybe sort of modern way of thinking about what the subject matter of aesthetics is. And one possibility is that there's actually this kind of ambiguity that's gone on over time between the way that we use the term aesthetics and this other question, which is about the sort of philosophy of art. And these two things are in contact, but you might think that there's one question, which is sort of this question about whether or not these two things are giving you the same sensations or perceptions. This other thing, which is what is aesthetically relevant in the sense of what's important to these things qua as works of art. And I suspect that the issues that Nelson is raising are intended to make us more and more, they're clearly intended to make us dubious about the former category, dubious about whether or not there's much of interest to be gotten out of this idea that we need to be focusing on some kind of information that we get by merely looking, some kind of information that we're given about what things are like merely from perceptual information. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Yeah.
I hate to bring in popular culture, but when you look at the Alec Baldwin case, you know, his point
What's the Alec Baldwin case? Does somebody want to fill me in?
I don't know.
He was shopping for a painting for Marion Goodman, I think.
Yeah.
It's a large abstract picture from 1998, and then she recently offered it to him for sale, something like last year, and it turns out to have been a copy of that painting from 1998 done last year and signed by the same artist. So it was a copy of
himself.
of one of his own pictures that was sold as the old picture, and
Yeah.
Alec Baldwin only figured it out later that it was more recent.
Exactly, and his claim was, I just don't have the same response to the second one. I knew there was something wrong. So that's going back to this age-old emotional aesthetic response. You know, the brushwork was the same, the coloring was the same, the technique was excellent. All of those standards by judging a painting were the same, yet he was claiming, God knows whether or not he, am I misquoting?
No, you're right. I was just going to say, I noticed the difference between the pictures, looking at them side by side.
I didn't see that.
Certain colors were
Interesting.
were slightly different hues. Some of the shapes were noticeably different if you flipped your eye back and forth. So there were differences, though as a whole, the painting read in the same way.
So just to draw this out a little bit and see what Nelson Goodman would have to tell Alec Baldwin. What was the order in which this went? So was Baldwin reporting that like I felt something was wrong, and then it was substantiated? Because that's actually something that Goodman discusses in this, is that like these cases of this notorious mid-20th century case of all these fake Vermeers. Of course, people in this kind of post-hoc way wanted to then go back and say, "Oh no, I always felt there was something weird about those."
Exactly.
And Goodman has something to say about that. So does anybody know whether in the case of these fake?
I would guess that it was afterwards, but I can't say. I don't want to say that for the truth.
It's
It
not-
definitely
yeah.
wasn't initially upon seeing the picture he thought, oh, this is weird. It was a couple of years after.
Oh, okay.
So it's unclear
Alright.
whether a friend tipped him off.
Exactly.
Should maybe
You know, it's Alec Baldwin.
rethink about this. Yeah, so it's just the opacity of the situation doesn't lend itself to analysis very well.
I think this raises an interesting issue, and one that I don't think that Goodman can really speak to. I mean, in a way, you might think. So, who was the artist that had copied their own earlier work?
Yeah.
I think it was a
I don't know.
contemporary artist?
Yeah, it's a contemporary artist.
Which made it even fuzzier because, you know, it's abstract expressionism and all. And the dealer actually went out of business. I mean, this is huge.
Yeah,
It was
that's
bad
very
news.
scandalous. Well, I mean, it's interesting thinking for a moment about why that is. There's a moment in the essay where Goodman makes the point, like, look, it's not just that like copies are bad. He makes the point that like maybe a Rembrandt painting that's actually a copy of some inferior artist might be superior to the work by the inferior artist, right? So one thing that one might suspect about this Alec Baldwin scenario is that perhaps it's the case that this was an inferior copy by the sort of same artist. So the artist wasn't able to achieve what they themselves had achieved, let's say 10, 15 years earlier. But you could imagine a scenario that would go in the reverse, right, where Alec Baldwin had all these like really powerfully positive responses to the painting that he hadn't predicted, and then he would discover that it was a superior copy of this person's earlier work. And then would we be as tempted to say that it wasn't an improvement or that it wasn't some kind of a variation on the original work? So I think that these things are delicate in interesting ways, because as Goodman clearly points out, there's not kind of an easy correlation between the fact of being a copy and an inferior aesthetic status vis-a-vis the thing that are copies. So
yeah. Also, it's hard to say if maybe he really liked the painting and only didn't like it after finding out that it was that there were two paintings that were similar to one another but are entirely different. So that kind of conceptual knowledge turned off his aesthetic appreciation.
that's the point that I think that Goodman is driving at.
Originality has a value.
Originality is such.
Originality has a value if it's represented as original. He makes that distinction, I think, with copies. Copies are not original. Also, the question of class, of finding the class of Rembrandt paintings that are Rembrandt paintings and a class of paintings that are not Rembrandt paintings. It's important to be able to distinguish that class, not only for the authenticator, but for the general public. It's important to be able to think through.
But I guess one question just keeps on recurring in all of this is important why. So that's why the very start of the essay is actually a little bit puzzling, right? So he's saying there's this acute theoretical problem, but he also says that that is it's going to potentially challenge a basic premise on which the very functioning of collector, museum, and art historian depend. If it turns out, you might as well just get a good copy, right?
Well,
and
still,
that's what we're
that's the
still
question, yeah.
trying to get at, and that's what's still, I think, up in the air.
I don't think it should make a difference. If it's a very good copy, then the information of its provenance shouldn't make a difference as to your aesthetic pleasure that you're receiving from the picture.
But I also think that you don't go and observe a painting without naked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you carry with you
Right.
a body of knowledge, of perceptions, of education, of information that kind of shape the way that you look at things. And so in the case of the museum and in the case of Alec Baldwin, I was thinking there is a breach of trust.
Yeah.
Right? Because you trusted that you bought that special painting or that you were seeing a Rembrandt and now it's not a Rembrandt. Doesn't it have anything to do with it or?
But is that an issue separate from a very pure aesthetic sense,
Right.
like perceptual
Yeah,
experience?
my question is that my point is that I don't think that there is a pure state of relating to something, to art.
Right, but there are instances where you see a painting and it doesn't have a caption, or someone's trying to sell you a painting and you can't trust the information that they're giving you as to who painted it and when, and then you have to rely on a purely perceptual experience of what you're seeing in front of you.
Correct, but that perception is also determined by my previous experiences of observing art, of reading, or etc., right?
Right.
So I think it's very difficult to have this pure perception. I think.
That-
you know,
I agree.
This is good. So, I mean, this points to why I'm so focused on this fact about why this is a basic premise for collector, museum, and art historian, right? Because I think there's this kind of separate question that you can ask. So, about like, you see a very beautiful sunset, and maybe like you have some kind of a very, very positive reaction to that. And maybe there are ways in which that experience of sunset is maybe mediated by like a lifetime of being told that sunsets are beautiful and seeing sunsets depicted in advertisements and in movies. But I think that there is sort of a sense in which even if you were going to be confronted with some sort of like painting that you sort of see on 88th Street or at a flea market, I think that the point that Anna is making here is that there's this kind of education that's even going to inform your assessment of works where the question of authentication doesn't even arise. And I think that's kind of a response in Goodman's spirit to the counter argument, oh, well, I mean, can't I just like something just by looking at it?
This is kind of a tangent, but I'm just wondering, I think it's kind of more interesting to consider paintings or art that most people would not consider beautiful than what most people would, because with, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but with well-rendered or classically beautiful things, you can admire them even if they're forged, because you can admire the craft that went into them.
Good.
But things that are art that is valued not because it's particularly, I'm missing the word, I don't know what word, well-rendered, but because it's interesting or because it's relevant or something like that, it would seem like it would be more important then, because you're not just looking to see how well-rendered it is, you're looking to see what it means.
But isn't that the same issue? In my mind, when we're discussing the difference between the original and the fake, it comes down to, and I hate to say it, but it's market value and commerce and copyright. Like, who had the idea first? And so I think it's the same concept when you're looking at, like, when you're talking about conceptual art. Or, Donald Judd, anyone could produce that thing. but he was the one that came up with the concept of what this represents. So in the end, isn't that what the distinction is?
I do want to put an asterisk on that, though, and say one of the things that's extremely striking about this chapter, and this is something that I hope we can talk a little bit more about, maybe in the second half, I think it becomes a little bit more relevant, which is the total absence of the discussion of the commodity question, the commodity question and the legal questions around copyright, which obviously puts a little bit of pressure on some of the distinctions that he wants to make later in the essay. So I do think that's relevant. And just to also respond to what Justine was just saying, I think that it's also striking, and again, I don't want to get too much into some kind of like historical contextualization of this document, which is this book that Goodman wrote, but it is extremely striking that this book that's coming out in this kind of, it's coming off of this moment of like avant-garde experimentation in the 60s, is working with this extremely conservative playbook in terms of like what kind of things are artworks. And this question that you're raising about the kind of way in which one could be sort of deferential to certain sorts of crafts. So imagine, let's just do a little thought experiment, imagine that I am, in fact I know people like this, I know an artist this is true of, so I don't even have to use my own case, so a fictional story involving me. So I have a friend named Bjorn, who is a sculptor, and he makes these really impressive large bronzes of kind of like animals in weird costumes. So before long, you're going to see a gigantic hippo wearing a tutu outside of Lincoln Center, and that's by this guy. And the work that he does is like incredibly conservative and unfashionable, right? I mean, these things look like things that you could imagine being at like at Disney World. This gigantic, like Fantasia, like this gigantic animal wearing a ballerina outfit, right? And so he's this extremely talented person with bronze, and in some sense, this like work that he's doing, like sort of harkens back to this entirely different era in terms of what people considered to be important in a sculptor. Like these gigantic, highly realistic bronzes of various animals and weird outfits. You know, it's like, it's this throwback to something that was already sort of, old-fashioned in the late 19th century, right? And so that's a case where you have somebody that has this sort of craft, this kind of skill. There's always going to be a market, people want that kind of object. But, I mean, his works are never going to be sold at like a Christie's or at a Sotheby's. That just will never happen. His work will never have art world value, because the kind of sculptures that have value in that sector has completely changed. So I think that's an interesting point, that one question that you have to ask in this context is sort of like, what role does authenticity and originality play in the specific situation where it's art that like my 6-year-old could have made, that kind of attitude. So I think that's important, and I think because Goodman is so focused on these kind of canonical artworks, and because he's not sensitive to the kind of significance that like an avant-garde practice is going to have for some of the things that he's talking about, that just doesn't arise. Yeah. So I think it's a bit of a blind spot, at least within the confines of this chapter.
Yeah, if you're discussing the value of a work of art, which he is, you have to distinguish originality, because a pair of Ringo Starr's drumsticks that he used to play some of the great Beatles songs go for $60,000, where an exact copy of those drumsticks, something that looks exactly alike, doesn't. Now, as long as you have...
Memorabilia is a funny case, right?
Well, memorabilia, but it runs throughout all of artwork and anything that needs to be authenticated. Anything that's auctioned, that has this sensibility about it, collectibles, anything collectible.
I would have thought, though, that one distinction one want to draw is between something that, I mean, years ago I read this text about antiquarian obsessions in 19th century France, like when they suddenly started to care about all their old stuff, like they hadn't cared for a long time, and then suddenly in the 19th century they're like, oh, medieval stuff is really important, and we really care about medieval stuff. And there was this concept that people ended up having of like what they called valeur d'ancienneté, so the value that something has just in virtue of being old. So I think that certain sorts of historical objects and memorabilia and things like that, this being the very like pump that Marilyn Monroe wore in this scene from Some Like It Hot, you know.
Or even an artist, the guy who does the older urinal, and presents this as a work of art. Now, this sells for a very high price because it's his presentation.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's just.
I would have thought that there's a huge difference between the Duchamp case and Ringo Starr's drumsticks. What does that?
Yeah.
Really
Well,
have?
it has to do with originality, does it not? It has to do with
But is the
original
originality
thing.
is the originality the same in the two cases? Is the sense in which those are Ringo Starr's
Not really,
original
but yes,
drumsticks the
also.
same in the sense that that's an original Duchamp, even if it's a found object? What do we think?
They strike me as very different. I mean, he didn't create the drumsticks, he just used them. I don't know. I mean,
Well, Duchamp didn't create the
Yeah.
urinal.
Oh, okay, that's true.
He just signed it.
But Duchamp wanted to make a statement.
Right.
Ringo didn't really want to make a
Exactly.
statement. He just used the drumsticks. But Duchamp had a specific goal in his
Mhm.
mind, and he wanted to make a clear statement.
Great, that's really helpful. Farah, right? So that's really helpful. So that's another thing. I'm trying to. The thing about a good philosopher like Goodman is he's shrewd. So there's something that he's focused on. There's something he's going to get at. But there are other things that are going to fall by the wayside. Commodity came up. The legal question came up. And there's another question that's profoundly absent from here is intention. Intention. And the idea that you care about what the artist had in mind is also totally
Exactly.
out of this. And again, I can't help but suspect that that's a self-conscious choice on Goodman's part. That it's not that Goodman is like unaware that these kind of questions are going to bear on how we think about art. But if he's specifically concerned about what it is that the philosopher needs to figure out, such that we can make sense of a curatorial practice, a museum practice, and a collecting practice, that's going to be this slightly different question. It's going to have to answer using slightly different concepts.
So what everybody's just said are different avenues of appreciation for an object, right? It can be the historical aspect of it, or it could be just the aesthetic, just the brushwork and the ability to render something, or it could be its price at the marketplace. And so Goodman begins the chapter with a quote, and if a fake is so expert, is it or is it not as satisfactory a work of art as it were unequivocally genuine? So
Satisfactory as a work
of art. So that might be entirely separate from its value as a commodity. It might be an entirely perceptual experience. But
It might be.
It might
But
be.
that's what he's rejecting.
But yeah, some people appreciate works of art based on their
Commodity.
value as a
Exactly.
commodity.
Sure.
The urinal, it's the example of the artist who is surfing this human capacity to have this desire to own an original of somebody who is a named artist. He's surfing this desire.
Well, he did that work before he was famous. I think he was kind of
Well, maybe
subverting the
help.
idea as a work of art as something
Sure.
from the artist's hand. But I think what we're all getting at is that there are multiple levels of appreciation for a work of art, and so it depends on the individual person as to whether provenance or it's coming from an artist's hand directly makes it satisfactory or unsatisfactory as a work of art.
Andy Warhol, for example.
I resonate most with Anna's point that it's informed. I was reading the history of the Mona Lisa one time, and it was a very obscure painting. Nobody really paid much attention, and then it got stolen. And after it got stolen, suddenly it came in the limelight, and now it's the world's most famous painting.
Mm-hmm.
But it's such a small little painting, and most people who would go to a museum would not even really even spend 1 minute by it. But just because it's so famous now, like there's like guards placed in front of it, and people have to queue up and just to get 30 seconds with the Mona Lisa. So it does make a difference what the authorities say and what the scholars say, and I think that
But to
that
whom, though, right?
to all of us.
I don't agree. I don't. My appreciation of the Mona Lisa isn't dependent on its fame and with many people. It's and maybe that has to do with a particular more attention being given to it.
Mhm.
But I think I appreciate it as something, as a work, as a perceptual experience apart from its fame.
But
Yeah,
it
but
does help.
That's for you. Most of us, look, Van Gogh couldn't sell any of these paintings. He sold 2 paintings. I think these were to his brother, and nobody would buy his art.
Right. Well, doesn't that duplicity that before it was worthless and now it's worth millions of dollars, doesn't that speak to the idea that there are so many levels of appreciation that none can qualify as making a work satisfactory or not?
I think that aesthetics blends with this commodity quality, what we're calling a commodity quality. It just blends, and it's hard to separate them.
I thought we were leaving out the commodity part.
Well, I think it's interesting that that it's separated out, and I think one question that we could ask is, given that, like, I mean, it's even very, very clear from from a number of allusions that Goodman makes in the course of this chapter that he's perfectly aware that there are these other dimensions of appreciation or ways that people consume artworks that he thinks of as not answering the specific question that he's interested in asking. I mean, one really excellent example of a moment when that happens is when he says, on page 112, he refers to the Tingle immersion theory, attributed to Emmanuel Tingle and Joseph Immersion, ca. 1800. So, I mean, he's clearly aware that there's this idea that what is very much a late 18th, early 19th century idea that somehow one has to try to come to a work of art somehow without all of these kinds of presuppositions that we had, sort of like, well, not presuppositions, but this kind of information that we had about things like its provenance and the mere fact that that, like, we know it exists and we know that we are supposed to think of it in a certain way as a consequence of a certain education we've had, as a consequence of the kind of symbolic role that maybe the piece of art plays in the wider culture. All of those things are, I think, on a certain conception, supposed to be the sorts of things that we can meaningfully subtract from the experience that we have of the work. And I think that one way to think about this theme, one word, like one term that you could use for this theme is this idea that, like, our aesthetic experience is kind of penetrable by factual knowledge. That this idea that we have sort of experiences of things as having aesthetic properties that are somehow independent from factual knowledge we have about them is a philosophical mistake. That might be the theoretical.
Say that again?
That the idea that we can have sensory experiences of objects in the world that we think of as being under certain categories. So, glass of water, etching, sculpture, Mona Lisa, the things that we're able to identify. I think that one could read this kind of theme of not being able to subtract our knowledge and experience from our encounter with the work of art as an instance of this much, much, much wider point.
I agree
about perception.
That those things can't be subtracted. And
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Gestalt psychology by any chance? It's a field that Ernst Gombrich studied and introduced into the wider field of art history. But it's how we it studies optical illusions and how those experiments in the laboratory prove that the most banal visual sensation is informed by a multitude of prior visual experiences. And so it's not only the medium or the format of a work of art that we kind of categorize and bring to our experiences, but also that our past experiences with other works of art and other visual forms, and going all the way back from when we initially gained sight, kind of all are cumulative and inform what we're seeing anyways. But does that change the fact that if we see a perfect copy, does that mean, and we know that one is a fake and one is a copy, does that necessarily change the quality or the set of previous past categorizations that we bring to our experience?
How does Goodman answer that question?
Actually, he says, what informs the nature and use of my present visual experience is not the fact or the assurance that such a perceptual discrimination is within my reach, but evidence that it may be. And such evidence is provided by the known factual differences between the pictures. Thus, the pictures differ aesthetically for me now, even though no one will ever be able to tell them apart merely by looking at them.
Right. So do you want to paraphrase that? Translated out of Goodman.
Yeah.
Well, it's just that it has value, and that he can't express exactly how, but an original has a value inherent in it that's beyond aesthetic.
Is he saying that?
I think that he
Couple
says
of
that
sentences.
the fact that he knows it's a
Your
fake
point.
will
Yeah.
impact
Yeah.
on his appreciation of the
Exactly.
aesthetics
What's
of it.
what's it?
The idea that one is a fake
No,
and one
yeah,
is...
if I know
Exactly,
that this
so-
one is a fake and the other one is not, even though they look the same, and I like this one best before,
Yeah.
now that I know it's a fake, I
Exactly.
like it less.
Yeah,
I
so that's
actually
not-
think he's making a more abstract point than even that.
Really?
So imagine you're brought into a room and somebody tells you, I'm not going to tell you which one, but one of these two paintings is the original and one of these two paintings is the fake. And you can do all
Whatever.
spectral analysis and everything and like put them in different light sources to your pleasure. Let's just suppose hypothetically that I think that Goodman would have to say in that case that your mere knowledge that one of the two is a fake is going to inflect your experience of them,
Exactly.
because you're always going to be asking yourself, you know, is this the Rembrandt or not? You know, so
Why is that?
it's
Can we say? I mean, does he say? And can we say?
well. I mean, I think that I would take the point to be that the mere fact that we have this kind of higher order knowledge, so not first order knowledge. First order knowledge would be like, that's the fake, that's the original. Higher order knowledge could be something like, I know one of these two is a fake, and I can't tell which. And I think what he's trying to urge is that there's some sense in which merely being in the presence of that skeptical doubt itself is aesthetically relevant.
But isn't that a presumption? I mean, what if somebody could walk into the room and just marvel at the fact that there are two beautiful Rembrandts and
Good.
Cézannes?
Good.
And they
So that shows you something that Goodman is assuming about what aesthetic relevance has to be like. That's not going to be the right answer.
Right. That's what he thinks.
Right. So
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting somewhere, right?
Wait,
so
can you
we're
repeat
trying.
that?
I got lost.
Okay.
So Goodman is saying that if you do know, say for instance, that there's one fake and one real,
Right.
then he assumes that a person walking into the room will be put off by that idea.
Correct.
But just as well, there could be a person that walks in and marvels at the idea that there's just two beautiful pictures, one next to the other.
But
Right.
one
It's-
presupposes information,
Yeah. And
so it's
Well, no,
contradictory.
the other person also knows that one is a fake and one is real, but he just appreciates
Yeah. Imagine
them
he's
both
just really
anyway.
relaxed.
So Goodman is saying that what we've been discussing about other information on this point is not valid?
No, I mean, I think that the question that we're finally reaching here is sort of, it's not like somebody can just sort of ask the question like, what's aesthetically relevant, and not have some presuppositions about what the common sense notion of aesthetic relevance is like. And I think that it's very clear that Goodman doesn't want the correct answer to be the guy that went in the room, looked at the two pieces knowing one or the other was a fake, and said, I'm having as equally a good time as if I thought that these were both, I mean, in a way it's a funny case, right? Because you can't go in and say they're both originals,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
You're going to know that one or the other. So it's peculiar, but I think that we're learning something about what Goodman thinks the kind of concept we're trying to analyze is like. And I take it, what's your name? I didn't get introduced to you earlier.
Anthony.
So I think that Anthony and Goodman are having a disagreement. So Anthony is, you're also disagreeing with Goodman. So the thought is that, like, no, you're wrong, Goodman. You haven't discovered this thing about aesthetic relevance, which is that there are aesthetically relevant differences that arise from pieces of factual information that cannot yet help you discriminate between the two things. Instead, you could actually go in and have, and I think that it's a really interesting question, like why Goodman thinks that kind of higher order information, the knowledge that one of the two is a fake, is the kind of thing that's aesthetic.
But maybe because he's more interested in the authenticity part of it and less in the aesthetic part of it. So
Yeah, because
that's
the other
why.
question would be who establishes the relevance, the aesthetic relevance? Is the critic, society, or is the individual? If we are talking about aesthetics. Now the authenticity, then it's another issue, and how it influences your perception of or your aesthetic appreciation of an object. No?
Well, he's assuming that authenticity is as an aesthetic is a relevant concept to aesthetic
Right.
appreciation.
Yeah.
Right.
I was just thinking, when I go to a museum and I see a piece of art or even an artifact that's very old, one of the things that makes it interesting and probably beautiful to me is the idea that people in the past have looked at it and had certain reactions to it. And if I know that something is new, so it hasn't had those kinds of, that doesn't have that history, that might impact the way that I perceive it. I mean, it's not from the five senses.
Interesting.
That's true, because when the guide points out the stone lions that were at the gates of Babylon and were looked upon by Meshach and Abednego, this means something to me. I mean, I don't know what it is, but there's a thrill that just goes through you when you see these lions, and they were looked on by biblical characters, Meshach and Abednego, and I forget the third guy. But, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were looked upon by these people. But then later on they discovered, no, these are a good copy, but they're a perfect copy of those lions, but they aren't the original lions. We discovered them somewhere in the sand over there. That would change completely my appreciation of what that is. It isn't merely aesthetic. And
Well, here's the really, really, really general problem. So I said at the start that you've got this thing where it's like there's this theoretical problem. The theoretical problem is going to bear somehow on this art world practice. I think we made a little bit of progress about that. I also said this acute theoretical problem has something behind it that's really a properly general philosophical problem. So I think that one thing that's striking is that you could, imagine you're at like the Ishtar Gates or something like that. You could ask yourself, as you're looking at them, like, is it possible these are a fake? But that's, of course, a question that you could be asking about your encounter with any work of art, whatever, right? So one thing that's sort of peculiar about this whole way of setting things up, and one thing that it kind of, I think, is sort of, very suggestive about this discussion is that he's saying that in the same way that, let me draw a really quick analogy. So suppose that I'm blithely hanging out and I'm totally confident my car is parked outside. Then somebody's like, Matt, there have been a lot of like carjackings in the neighborhood recently. Some philosophers think that my knowledge that my car is parked where I left it has gone away. I no longer know that at the point when the doubt has been raised. That somehow defeats knowledge because suddenly I'm considering possibilities that I wasn't. And I think that what Goodman might be driving at in this is that there are things that are aesthetically relevant that have that character.
Yeah.
Where it's like once the specter, once the possibility of something being a fake is raised, then you no longer, in the same way that I no longer know my car is parked outside, I'm no longer sure I'm having the experience I thought I was having.
But
Because it might be.
experience?
Well, but that's the point. It's like, it might be that I'm having experiences that are indiscriminable. I can't tell the experiences are different, but they might be different experiences in virtue of being experiences of different things.
But also to talk about experience, our experience is not always properly accessible to us, our
Right.
true experience. Like we see the sun going every day from east to west, and
Good.
that's our true experience. But then along comes a theory and tells you that no, that's not exactly what's happening. It's actually the earth is moving. So
It's the persistence of
so
truth. that
it's
he's-
not that our experience is all that authentic all the time. You know, a little theoretical knowledge changes it.
Right, which is why I think, look, there's this whole bit about, like, scientific instruments, and drilling down and drilling down and drilling down, and why shouldn't I think that I can see what's on the other end of a microscope, right? And so that just shows that one of the things that's in the background here is a very, very general question about the sort of what sometimes gets called the manifest versus the scientific image, the things that we perceive involving medium-sized dry goods and things of roughly a scale that we're capable of just looking at, and then these other things that we want to say that we perceive. We want to say that we see, in some sense of see. We want to say that we can see distant galaxies by studying them through telescopes. But I think that there is this kind of difficulty then for what is otherwise a very, very sort of comfortable idea, which is that there is some sort of nicely delimited range of things that are properly my experiences, and those things are what's giving me knowledge. Because as soon as you start really wanting to save that idea, you have to say things like, I don't see anything on the other end of a microscope. I don't see anything on the other end of a telescope. And so,
Well, it's
I think that
provisional instead of eternal. It's a provisional truth instead of an eternal truth.
what does provisionality have to do with it?
Well, it can change. Once you're aware that things can change. I mean, wasn't he getting at this with his paper on the blue paper?
That's for a different philosophy meetup.
It's the
If we get into the problem of induction now,
it's the persistence
we'll
of truth.
never...
It's the persistence of a truth value and the interchangeability of it, and the fact that it could change. For example, parallel lines were once thought never to be able to cross.
Mhm.
But now, if we see them projected against a curved surface, then we can see that they might cross at some point.
I think that's a fascinating issue, but I'm not totally sure I see the connection to this problem in the philosophy of perception about the distinction between things that I say I experience and about my experience.
It's the sun changing direction. Instead of going from east to west, it suddenly changes west to east. It's a possibility. I mean, maybe it comes up in David Hume, where he says you can't count on causality. Causality is not a constant out there. You really can't count on it. It's just a prejudice of mind, is it not? It's just one damn thing. Life is just one damn thing after another, and we can't. One thing doesn't predict another. This is a prejudice of mind.
Do you see the problem of induction in the chapter?
Yes.
Where?
Well, it defies aesthetics. It puts aesthetics aside and says, beyond aesthetics, what if the fact about the situation of this artwork under consideration changes? What if something we believe about it changes?
Well, we have to be careful about how we articulate this, because the facts don't change, right? Facts can't change, right? On any plausible, normal sense of like facts, they can't.
Our sense of
Good,
our
right?
sense of the
So now we're back to the issue about how it is that these higher order thoughts, the thoughts that we have about our first order thoughts, the thought that we have about our belief that this thing is one way or this thing is the other way, this kind of idea that we can have a belief that doesn't have the content, that's the fake, that's the original, but a belief that has the content, one of these two guys is the fake. Why Goodman thinks that can be aesthetically right, right? And what I was sort of trying to suggest, and maybe the earlier suggestion was a bit obscure, is that consider the following thought. We can be incapable of discriminating between two different experiences that we're having that are actually different experiences. So I can be wrong, I can believe so I look at the fake, I have a certain experience. I believe it's identical to the experience that I have when I'm looking at the original. Goodman says I'm not. Those aren't the same experience, right? And when you're made aware, and the key thing is that the reason why he thinks that knowing that one or the other is going to be the fake is going to change, is going to be aesthetically relevant, is in some sense going to change your actual experience, is you're not going to be sure which experience you're in. The experience of the fake or the experience of the original, even if you can't tell those experiences apart, right? So I think that's the kind of deeper philosophical problem that's behind this, because that's general, right? That's a general problem. That's a problem about, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, maybe somebody can help me out with the name of this. I'm not sure if I remember the name of it, but there's this well-known psychological disorder, mental illness, where a delusion, actually, where you start to believe that your partner or your child has been replaced by an identical copy, and no amount of your wife or your husband or your child reassuring you, no, it's me, what are you talking about? You're alienated from them, and you somehow form this really, really powerful belief that that's a stranger, that there's been this kind of body snatching situation. I think that Goodman is partly concerned with, in some very, very philosophical and very, very abstract sense, that kind of a scenario. So one in which a different object in the world could be giving you experiences that are completely indistinguishable from another object. And so it turns out that this problem about what's aesthetically relevant to a work of art actually winds up turning on this extremely general problem about knowledge and perception that's not particular to artworks.
I have a question as an aside, and maybe you guys discussed this earlier, but when we talk about the fake, is the idea that this fake was created with the intention of sort of tricking people into thinking it was the original, versus I can imagine a scenario where someone makes maybe a very simple painting, maybe like some modern thing, just canvas with like a dot on it, and somebody else, completely independent of knowing that someone had created this, creates the exact same thing. So now you have two identical pieces of art, but one wasn't created with the intention of imitating the other. They were both created independently. Is the one that came after somehow considered a fake? So you have the same situation where you have two indistinguishable pieces of art, but in one case, the second wasn't made with the intention of reproducing the other. I just want to nail down exactly what we mean by fake when we're talking about the fake.
Excellent, very good. So, I think you brought up an interesting point. So earlier I observed that in addition to there not being any kind of a Marxist analysis in here, there's no concern with, and this we'll get to more after we break, there's not a concern with commodities, there's not really a concern with the legal question, the copyright question. I also said maybe there's not a concern with the intention question. Does the notion of a fake, does the concept of something being a fake actually necessarily introduce the question of intention in the back door? So even though Goodman isn't talking about artistic intentions in the paper, even though it's not a dimension that's relevant for him in making his point, I think partly because he's trying to press on this much more general philosophy of perception, knowledge kind of thing. But it's true. What do we think about that? Is there such a thing as an unintentional fake, an accidental fake?
I mean, I think almost maybe overlaps two things that are so similar are going to have some root of commonality. I mean, they might not. It's hard to imagine two things that are exactly the same, kind of sprouting from nothing. I don't know, but I guess that's the thought that I'm having.
Well, I mean, imagine you have one of those replicators from Star Trek. I mean, it's conceivable that one could have a way of just reproducing it in a way that would be an atom for atom copy. It would be like metaphysically just the same object. It would have all of the same intrinsic properties as the other object. And so presumably at that point, things like your concern with other people having experienced it in the past would kick in, because it would be this fresh thing. So one way of thinking about the whole issue is that maybe on top of these kind of sort of considerations that Goodman is adducing, we also have to worry about relations that these objects bear to other things. And so your desire to have this object that has been much admired and looked at and owned by all of these other people over time, that's another way in which art objects accrue value, is by having been in certain sorts of collections. And one way in which artworks can have their value manipulated is by being placed in certain museums. It's a notorious fact about the way in which donors operate when giving their artworks to certain museums and loaning them, that they're increasing both the prestige and the value of all of the artworks in their collection, maybe manipulating the market for the specific artists that they've collected a lot of. So I think that those are all important questions. But just to get back to the kind of replicator picture, what does people think about how the replicator, the idea that you could have an atom for atom copy, how does that bear on this issue of what experience you're having?
Well, you can look at photographs, for
Yeah.
instance, right? That you can have like the same negative or the same file being reproduced by the same originator of the art, and so instead of having one, you have 10. So they are identical, created from the same file by the same person. So your appreciation, I would assume, of either copy would be the same, wouldn't it?
Well,
That's great. I like that. So this is the issue about, and this is maybe sort of taking us in the direction of the stuff in the second half of the chapter about these differences between music versus dance versus printmaking. So this would be a case, right, where certainly like you want the autographed copy with the number, but unless you're somehow superstitious, you're probably not going to care which out of an edition of 12 is the one that you end up in. Actually, I'd be curious whether or not there's some extra value added to like the first
number one
printing.
is usually much more expensive.
Really? Okay.
There are also artist proofs, which aren't released, but could be exactly the same as the rest of the edition, or they could have slightly other variations. But that's the same. There's someone who's superstitious about which number print they get. That's the same superstition as delegitimizing an aesthetic experience, because that particular painting wasn't painted by Rembrandt himself.
Oh, I think there's a huge structural difference between the cases. So in the one case, you're dealing with, just think about the discussion about printmaking in the second half of the chapter. So in that case, what it means to count as an original, what's the name of a famous photographer? An original Diane Arbus, let's say. An original Diane Arbus. And suppose there are like 10 prints of a certain Diane Arbus photograph in existence that she herself made in her own blackroom. What it counts to be an original of that piece is just to be one of that set, right? Whereas I take it that the point that and so look at it this way: any experience you have of one of the Diane Arbuses in that set is an experience of an original. Now, it might be the case that somebody has another. I think it's very plausible that, there are probably lots of reproductions, especially of photographs, that are maybe even technically completely. Imagine somebody went into Diane Arbus's own blackroom without her knowledge and developed some more sort of unauthorized copy of her thing. Well, then there's a fact of the matter about you having an experience of a Diane Arbus versus you not experiencing having a Diane Arbus, just because of which object it is, even if you, through introspection, can't tell which experience it is that you're having. right? I think that's the Goodman thought. It's like you're in clone world, and there's another one there, and that's a different thing that you're experiencing, whether or not you're ever going to be able to tell the difference.
So Nelson Goodman believes that those are two independent experiences.
Experiences that you might not be able to tell
that
apart.
we might not be able to tell apart. But we want to know the truth of that. Are those different experiences? Like, why I think the parallel between editions of photographs and the thought experiment of a perfect forgery that can't be told apart. I think they do relate to one another well, because especially with the idea of a replicator, of having the same perfect replica on an atomic level, right? And as a thought experiment. Are you really getting a different understanding of the original master's hand?
Different understanding
or a different perceptual experience?
I want to leave us with a question, and then maybe we'll take a break. So I'm really glad that you're resisting, because I think this is something that this thought that Goodman's having should be resisted. I don't think this is like a straightforwardly correct thought. But I want to be clear about what the thought is. So I think he's asking, do we care what our experiences are of? Right? Because you could have an experience that you can't tell it's of one thing versus another. What is the relevance of what's causing that experience? Right? And he's clearly saying it is a dimension that is aesthetically relevant to the assessment of artworks, that is the one thing versus the other thing, even if the experience itself is as far as we can tell, the same experience. We're getting the exact same pleasure in the two cases. They're caused by different things. And I think that that's the sort of challenging thought
So
that
he's saying
having.
authenticity matters in the experience. That's his thing.
I think that he's saying that this old philosophical idea that the experience I have when the evil demon is like deceiving me about everything when I'm in like the Matrix or whatever is the same experience that I would be having if I weren't in the Matrix is wrong. That they're different experiences. We care about whether we're having the one or the other, even if there's no way for us to tell which one we're having. Should we break?
Sounds good.
Cliffhanger.
That's a big question. So if anyone needs to use the bathroom, go down to the end, make a
There's this movie called Beltracci. Has anyone seen that?
Yeah,
It's
Wolfgang.
on Netflix.
Yeah, it's a documentary about the.
About a forger?
Yeah,
probably
he did it for 30 years. He didn't get caught, and he was so good.
Yeah.
Everyone
And
should help themselves, by the way.
he
It's all
used that same thing, like he noticed gaps in the works of artists, so he would produce paintings from those periods.
Which is exactly what Goodman talks about, right? That, like where you find these kind of areas, these zones, where it's kind of consistent with what the artist was doing earlier and later, that they did that in the middle, but there's no direct comparison.
And he even put like, he would
Oh, please. He put...
he would frame things, and then he would put dust in the frame on top, so that, because, so that it looked like it had been sitting for 200 years.
Yeah.
What's the name
Put it
again?
in a bar, in a Spanish bar, so there would be smoke, and, he just got everything right.
That's so good.
Then one time, out of sheer laziness, he used a tube paint instead of, he used to mix his paints.
He used the wrong white. He used titanium white in a zinc white that didn't exist in that time period.
At that time, it was from a tube, and then when it was being vetted, they caught him. So now he's sitting in prison, but he was so good.
You just have to slip up one time, man, and then off to jail.
It's on Netflix. I hope it's still there. Beltracci.
Yeah,
Check it out.
The art of the forgery or something like that.
There was a film that came out a number of years ago. It's one of my favorite first release films I've ever seen in New York City, which is actually an entire film on this anti-Goodman certified copy by the Iranian director Abbas Kiarostami. And it's this kind of tribute to all of these kind of classic 60s era French and Italian New Wave films that Juliette Binoche and is fantastic because the film features a man sitting an essay. Not an essay, in Italy. Starting this essay about how forget about getting an original, a fake is better. And so the character Juliette Binoche is in this kind of sort of antiquing business. There's a scene where she's like showing him around and she's like, that one's a fake and that one's real, and he seems really, really disinterested. And so at a certain point the film we don't know what's happening anymore because she's really irritated. This guy who's not very engaged with him intellectually, very disinterested. It's a statement about the husband and wife when they're acting. Starts play acting like she's his wife. They're like an old married couple and they're gonna have youth. And so for the rest of the film, there's this ambiguity. Was the first half of the film a game that this married couple was playing with each other, where they pretended they didn't know each other when they're on this vacation, or is these people that don't? Yeah. Okay. So. So it's really fun because there's a lot of flipping between languages. So some of it's in English, some of it's in Italian, and it's so interesting because what Karasami is really from this perspective. It's like this vision of like France and Italy, a French woman, and all these kind of categories. So intrigued by the cinema references that he has, of course, that it's just really cool because he's in a way making his own copy of these classic French and Italian films from the 60s, and so it's very meta. I like it a lot.
What was that?
Strachey.
What was that called?
Certified copy. Copia conforma.
Does Schopenhauer's work have any relevance to what we're talking about?
I haven't thought about Schopenhauer at all. Ever. I've never read Schopenhauer. So I can't.
Only because Nietzsche loved Schopenhauer and decided to look at Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
I found that,
Compelling?
yeah, like we all pre-programmed to like certain things, certain shapes, certain forms, and go into many different art forms, architecture.
Cool. Is that in The World is Blown Representation, or is that in another text that he does this stuff about painting?
I might have even read an extract from it
Oh,
somewhere.
okay. Cool.
I don't know if it's in the way, but maybe it's in there.
No, he wrote a dissertation. So he had to write a dissertation. There's this thing called the fourfold roots of sufficient reason or something like that, which is basically his thesis. And then the rest of his life he was just almost entirely working on the big book. But interesting. I'll fish on. I'm actually supposed to teach Schopenhauer in the spring at NYU. I'm not doing it myself. I'm kind of helping the guy who's teaching.
So do people audit classes?
No, that's one of the reasons why I'm so keen on doing things like this, and also the Brooklyn Institute classes, because I think it's just, I don't understand what the prejudice is in this country, that people are supposed to stop thinking when they're not getting a degree. I just fundamentally don't get that. Great, that's great. So with NYU, it's much more traditional than that. It's like they have continuing education programs. Well, I'm not sure about all the details. I just know that it's not the case that when I'm teaching a bunch of NYU undergrads, I have auditors that are not working on their bachelor's degree. And so, yeah, I think it is too bad. And, for that reason, Columbia neither. But Columbia does offer these courses that are mixed. So I know that in the summers, they offer courses that are I was in one many, many years ago. It was a great class on Proust, and just people from. I just don't like this kind of. Classes are more interesting when they're cross-generational. People are coming with different backgrounds, and so it's claustrophobic to always teach teenagers. So that's one of the reasons why I teach for the Brooklyn Institute, and why I was happy that I got put in touch with Justine so that I could do something else.
What's your experience been with your undergrads?
NYU students are, very cosmopolitan. You know, I mean, I have like these insane classes. I mean, they just opened up this campus in Shanghai. There's like all of these students in my classes now that have been doing their year abroad. So I've got this cool contingent of sort of Shanghai natives, and then and then just people from all over. That's the one really good thing about teaching there. I mean, the thing that's depressing about it is, of course,
They're all rich.
well, it's a very corrupt institution in so many ways. So NYU,
It's a brand.
it's like it's a massive real estate monopoly.
It's a corporation.
It's like it's very creepy. And they have these like I almost think one of these days somebody's going to write like the history of New York University, and the title of the book is going to be called Empire State of Mind.
No, because they have too many people who will squash that story. Don't worry.
But the
Well,
drama
that's a shame.
school is supposed to be good and.
I have Tisch students. Yeah, I have Tisch students. Actually, the student that's doing best in my logic class, I love this. My best logic student, wait for it. He's a Tisch, and his major, game design. I'm like, of course the game design major is gonna be the best at logic. Duh. It's like easy for him. So.
Yeah, but don't you find it, because I'm a high school teacher, so talk about adolescents, but I teach in Westchester, and I find it really depressing teaching just like pretty much white rich kids. You don't experience that at NYU?
It's definitely not ethnically homogeneous. It's not ethnically or religiously homogeneous at all.
Or
Like
socially, or social class-wise.
Class-wise, yes, I do think that it is pretty homogeneous class-wise. But I mean, a lot of them are going massively into debt to be there. It's not like all of my students can afford their education. Some of them are doing it in a way that's really irresponsible.
Oh, so then they're not all rich kids.
Not all of them. I think the majority. I think that something like, I would have guessed that probably more than half of my students are significantly well off. You know, I was at a protest the week after the election, and some of the speakers were only here on DACA or were like, unregistered. So I have a hard time believing that those guys are wealthy.
That's good.
They're like unregistered
But they're,
immigrants.
it would just be interesting to have those voices in your philosophy class.
I have them in my class. I walked out with those kids.
And
I
they're
did a
in your
walkout
classes.
in my class. It's a little bit awkward to have a politically motivated walkout in the middle of logic. But,
Right.
I mean, you do what you can.
Or do you find a variety of, I mean, and how do I say this politically correctly? Other environments, I'm sure, when you're discussing these issues, or not necessarily, they all can get down to the essence of it.
I mean, when I taught last year, I feel like there were definitely students that I had that came in and were like, well, I'm a Christian, and I just want to preface all of that. But that's fine. I mean, I'm totally fine with somebody flagging, like saying, like, I think that there are souls, so I'm going to react a certain way to this philosophical position. I'm totally open to that.
Sure.
I think it's very positive.
And they were upfront about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are. They're pretty sophisticated. I mean, it's a tough environment to navigate, and by the time I get them, they've usually had at least a year or two of it. I haven't really.
More upperclassmen.
You know, like I think I've taught intro classes that had like a lot of people. Like, not so many people that were had just gotten there.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Oh, there's so many different places that we could go at this point. It's interesting. So, one thing, maybe it would be worthwhile at this point in the discussion to do what I said I was going to do and move us on to the second question that Goodman is concerned with. Because I think that there could be a really, really fruitful conversation that we could have for the rest of the time about genres and about what Goodman is suggesting in the second half of the paper about genres. So, first half of the paper, he's kind of urging that there's an aesthetic significance to whether or not something is a fake, because you don't just care about the experience we have, we care about what the experience is of. We care about what's causing the experience. And that's like a substantive claim that he makes. But then there's this interesting turn that the thing takes, where you say, okay, well, only certain things can be faked. Right. And why are certain things, certain art forms in some sense like fake proof? And I think that's like a really interesting question. So does anybody want to help me understand this distinction he draws between the autographic and the allographic?
Because the question doesn't arise for certain things,
Right.
like in music, is it an original symphony? It's original only if it's true to the way it was it was meant to be played. But there's not really the question of fake or real, or I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Good. Is everybody satisfied with that thought, though? Does everybody think that that's correct?
Because jazz does whatever it wants, and it's still sort of.
Jazz is actually a really, really interesting case for all of this stuff, right? Because any art form that's based on improvisation is going to involve certain questions for how you sort of categorize the sort of specific techniques of improvisation, these kind of forms that arise, like, scat singing, that's definitely like a recognizable sort of jazz technique. You could imagine it notated, but I don't think that somebody notates in the way that you would like a bunch of coloratura variations that somebody would sing in the middle of a Bellini aria. You're not going to get that for, nobody's going to sit down and write like the scat that Ella Fitzgerald sang in Mac the Knife or something like that. But in principle, it's possible.
But I think that in art and music and dance, there are two issues. One issue is the, if you can call that the original piece, the written piece, or the choreography in terms of the dance, right? And that can be copied, or you have a lot of plagiarism, however you pronounce that, right? In both in music and in dance. And the other issue is how you interpret what you read in the partiture or in the choreography. And that relates to what you said is how it's meant. Do we know how it's meant, if it's only written, or it's a sequence of steps, of pliés and dégagés and things like that? Do we know how, you know what I mean? So the meant, the interpretation of in both music and dance, I think, together with the written part is what makes art, or it makes an experience.
In those particular genres,
In
right?
those two, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So
It just strikes me that with dance in particular, you look for creativity and the sequences and originality and stuff like that, but in general, you're looking to see how closely somebody can emulate perfection, or whatever somebody's ideal is of perfection in dance, or perfection in that genre of dance. I don't know. Maybe that's not the right intuition, but you say he did a great plie or something because he was just like this guy who does great pliés.
But this is only the technique. It doesn't have to do with the interpretation of how the work meant to be performed. In that sense. You can separate the technique from the feeling in both music and dance.
Yeah, but it's still true that we often judge people's technique based on comparison, not by how differently they can do it, but by how similarly they can do it.
By the standard. By a standard.
Yeah. I don't know.
well, this gets into this issue just to really quickly put that thought in the context of the Goodman. So that gets into this issue of constitutive versus contingent aspects of a work, right? And I think that one thing that one might sort of suspect here is that, while that's a well-founded distinction, I want to say some things are the work of art itself. These things are the dance. These things make up the symphony, and these things are features of its interpretation or possible ways in which the dance might be realized. Some better, some worse. We might want to recognize that there has to be some kind of a distinction like that, but be maybe unhappy with the way that Goodman is drawing the line, or maybe dubious about how good we are at telling the difference between the constitutive features of work of art, the things that give that work its identity, that mean this is this piece by Tchaikovsky as opposed to this interpretation of that symphony. We might be dubious, and in the case of choreography, as I think Goodman shows some sensitivity to this fact. In the case of dance, there are these kinds of sort of traditions. So when you go and you see a performance of Swan Lake, typically it's going to be sort of like this kind of amalgam of what I guess people imagine was the original Petit Pas choreography, the original choreographer, and then there's this kind of tradition that kind of comes out of it, that's kind of been in all these different ways kind of adapted and like warped and like altered and back and forth. So I think that I think that one question that sort of immediately arises in that context is, do we want to say that the choreography of Swan Lake is this thing that was done in the late 19th century, that like nobody's been able to perform it since? Or is this kind of evolving like object that now you can go and see this at the Paris Opera and AVT, and if you were going to be really honest, you'd have to add all these footnotes and there would be all these other names, and so it becomes this sort of collective work of art. So that's just to say that there can be cases where we were perhaps like very tempted by the thought that the contingent stuff is the tradition, and the constitutive stuff is the thing that the famous person made. But there are all of these cases in which you're just never going to have access to the constitutive thing.
I mean, you'll never know how the dance was actually performed, say in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't look at that dance, and even if you go into the music itself,
Mm-hmm.
You have different musical instruments.
Yeah.
The instruments are a little different.
Right.
Now you have like the little score and stuff like that, and there's little notations on how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of tell the orchestra how to play this. There's a lot of different technical terms,
Mm-hmm.
right? But again, you can't say, you can't hear that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like in the picture or a statue, I mean, you can see what the thing is, right? And you can't do that. You can't experience that the same way, with, say, dance and with music. At least dance and music, You just can't do it.
Good. I like the suggestion about thinking about original instruments, right? So one thing that's going on around the time that Goodman is writing this is this big movement, especially strong in the UK, but there were like versions of it in New York. In a way, it's kind of an ongoing thing, which sometimes gets called historically informed performance. So that's this kind of movement to say, let's stop playing these Bach pieces with these massive 19th century symphony orchestras. It's absurd. It's like not the kind of sound that this was ever intended to sort of make. And so there's this kind of movement to try to do something that sort of approaches kind of a reproduction, and it's completely changed the way that we hear even works that were just canonical repertoire all throughout the 20th century. So an excellent example of this is Mozart operas. So, if you listen to these kind of classic recordings from the 1960s of these pieces, with like Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and sort of people, and Joan Sutherland, these people from this kind of really classic 60s and 70s generation, there are no ornaments, right? So when they do the repeat in a Mozart aria, they would just do a repeat. It would be a straight repeat. There'd be no variations. But of course, everyone was perfectly aware when they engaged in that practice that we can't put notes in this aria that Mozart didn't write. But of course, the reason why there was a repeat was for the soprano or the baritone or for the tenor to show off a bit. So add little effects, right? And so people considered it to be this really important thing about changing the performance practice to reflect something that's not in the score. And so by Goodman's criterion, not constitutively part of Don Giovanni, not constitutively part of Così fan tutte, but which I think that we would be very, very tempted to say actually, in some sense, was maybe more accurate to the work based on our knowledge of the performance tradition, not based on our knowledge of the score, right? So that already makes this whole idea of the constitutive contingent distinction problematic, right where Goodman seems to think that it's not. Does anybody have any reactions to that? Any
Can you
further
just
thoughts?
clarify a little bit? I mean, so an original Mozart, are you saying that there was room for a certain kind of improvisation or flexibility?
Absolutely.
And that's what you were trying to replicate?
It was completely conventional in like from Handel through Mozart, probably for a couple of generations of composers after Mozart. But the reason there was even a repeat movement in an aria, in a Handel aria, there's like an A, a B, and an A repeat. So there's some sort of middle section where you do some stuff, but then when you go back and you go back to the main melody, the idea was there would be these kind of expressive things where the singer, based on their own discretion and to show off their own technique, would introduce all these different types of variations. And since at least the certain singers in the 60s, definitely gaining traction in the 70s, this became the standard way that Handel was performed. Now you couldn't go to see a Handel opera where there wouldn't be all of these pyrotechnics and showing off in the repeat of the A section. Now with Mozart, because everyone knows those classic 50s and 60s recording, because people are more conservative in the way they approach that material, don't necessarily approach it in the spirit of historical rediscovery, you could still go into a lot of Mozart performances where you're not going to see anybody have those effects. And certain opera critics and certain opera fans find them tasteless, right? Have a very negative reaction to them. But of course, we know, as a matter of historical fact, that these singers in Mozart's era fully expected, and in fact did, perform variations, ornaments, extra fancy things to show off their technique in the repeat section of a given aria. And that's why the repeat is there, not just so that we can hear the melody one more time exactly the way that we heard it the first time.
But that goes,
Sorry, go ahead.
that goes to your original question, can certain things not really be faked and not really copied? And then to piggyback with that, it's intention. Because I think about plays, there are revivals. Is that a copy? No, it's a revival of the original. It's a reinterpretation.
Good.
I wonder if, in the case of music, I feel like when Mozart writes, whatever, the music, like the actual notes on the page, is what he's created, and so that's. But then the artists that perform it are creating a different piece of art. So those are two distinct things. One is what's written on the page, and one is what's performed.
So you're with Goodman.
I suppose so. I think you're.
I'm with Goodman too. I don't think that from what I understood, he's trying to say that it's not proper to speak about faking in certain circumstances, like music and dance.
Yeah.
So that's the broad point that he's making. So
Oh, I definitely agree with that. The point that I'm pressing on here is that he wants there to be this distinction that's special in music between the thing that is the musical work itself, that's guaranteed by the notation, and these other things, which are these kind of contingent features, which are basically the performance itself, and what you do on the basis of the score. And the reason I brought up the Mozart example is the ornaments aren't in the score. They're not in the score because Mozart expected, as singers conventionally did at the time when he wrote those operas, that they would just do their own thing when the thing repeated, right? And so out of fidelity to the score, out of fidelity to the work itself, these constitutive features, we're actually going against what is intuitively an extremely important part of the work that was in some sense external to the score.
I feel like how can you say that Mozart, if he's saying let the artists have freedom to like be creative, then that's not, Mozart isn't responsible for whatever creative dressings the artist who actually performs it comes up with.
But Mozart is responsible for writing a work in a music making context in a certain way, anticipating that singers are going to do certain things, right? And so I would say that it's part of the music in these cases, but not part of the score.
But then we just
I
have
think
to.
the same case would be like you start with the C and then make up what you want for the middle and then end with the C. You know, that's not my work of art. if someone else goes and performs that.
It's like a John Cage score. We have pieces like that. That's the other thing that's weird about this, is that he's not sensitive to the possibility of these avant-garde practices, which would precisely consist of giving you a score, quote-unquote score, that's so subject to your own interpretation, that's so indirectly related to the thing that you're going to be making, that it becomes puts a lot of pressure on this idea that the work is constituted by the instructions, given how many of the things the instructions are going to leave up to you, right? There are in fact these Cage works where, you know, it's a substantive, very, very difficult project to prepare a performance of them, because essentially virtually every aspect of the piece is up to your interpretation, because it's not written on traditional staffs, right? There'll be this kind of chaos, this kind of jumble of sort of figures. I think he got them using the I Ching, and then you're supposed to sort of make a piece of music out of that, right? So that's a score, but it definitely seems to be very, very, very different from the thing that Goodman has in mind. And I think that that's another, maybe a weakness of the position, is that it's not really accurate to all the things that a score could possibly be. And, you know, he can say, maybe Goodman would say that score is not notation, but we might think that that's not the right answer. Yeah.
But I think that isn't it just as simple as flipping what our definition of what authentic is in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Like the real authentic part is leaving out the embellishments, and we should take that as authentic.
Mm.
So we just revise our definition of what's authentic in the case of Mozart and jazz and things like that, because it is the...
Oh, I see. So I think maybe good. So I think maybe there's a thing about how the question needs to be sort of set up that I've maybe been a bit sloppy with, right? So I think that in the second part of the paper, when he's asking about whether it's possible for these works to be fakes, why it's not possible for there to be a fake of certain works of art versus others, I think that the way that he's trying to ask that question is it in the nature of this work of art for it to be completely constituted by a single physical instance of the work or not? So the question isn't primarily, in the second part of the essay, about authenticity versus inauthenticity. The question is definitional. Where do you draw the boundaries of a work versus an interpretation? And he needs that distinction because that's going to explain why you can print indefinitely many copies of George Eliot's Middlemarch, but you're never faking Middlemarch. Whereas reproducing many, many, many copies of an autographic art piece don't have that character. And the only reason why I was bringing up this stuff about Mozart and embellishments and things like that is I think that this idea that what is the work of art can totally be thought of as just the score, and all the rest of the stuff is interpretation, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Because they're going to be features that we actually think are very, very essential to the work of art that we only know about through a performance tradition, and that aren't in the score. So that's just one reason to be skeptical that maybe the way that things are being set up here is entirely right.
I don't know, it just strikes me, going back to the play example.
Good, I'm glad we're going back to that. I think it's important. You brought up plays, yeah.
I take acting classes, and one of the ways that, or the way that you make a performance great is by focusing on your actions and making certain choices about your actions when you're saying lines. And what makes a performance good is choices about their actions. I mean, also, there are other things too, like about how they talk and that kind of thing, but mainly it's about your actions and what you're going to do with your actions. There's a lot of room in most screenplays and most plays for making those kinds of choices. Even playwrights who are very controlling or who want the play to be performed in a particular way, there's so much room for interpretation. And if there weren't, what would be the value of seeing a play? You could just read the play or see a movie version of the play. I mean, you're going to see the kind of choices that the actors make to make their actions. And if an actor makes the kind of choices or the same choices than actor in a previous performance has made, you generally think that he's not doing a good job, that he hasn't thought enough about how he wants to make the choices. You value somebody making original choices. So I think, I don't know, applying that to the music analogy, I think that, and aside from like the feeling of self-congratulation, like we're all here to listen to his music and we're all great people, you could just stay home and listen to a record if you wanted to hear the same thing over and over again. You want to see choices.
Sure. Well, I think that Goodman is actually sensitive to that point when he says you can fake somebody else's performance, but you can't fake a performance of the work. Right? You can fake somebody else's performance of the same piece. You can say, conduct Mahler like you're Lenny Bernstein, and that can be noticeable. But you're still conducting Mahler, right? You're still performing the piece, you're just performing the piece the way that somebody else is. You're not failing to act Blanche in Streetcar Named Desire, you're just acting it exactly like Vivian Leigh, and it's terrible, right? So I think that he's aware of that. That's what he's concerned. That I don't think is maybe something. That's not something I think that Goodman is failing us on. What I'm wondering is when he says things like, "It's going to count as a performance of the play if it's in accordance with stage directions." What do we think of it? It says that on page 120. He says that there are things that are going to need to be done for it to count as a performance of the play. What do we think has to be true of a production of something to count as a performance of that play or not? Do we think what sort of criteria are relevant?
But I disagree.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And I think that's the distinction between the plastic arts and the other kinds of arts. Plastic arts, you can kind of draw a circle around what that object is. That's what the original is. When it comes down to a play, my perception, my definition of the play would be the lines, the actual dialogue, the actual story. I would draw the line around what the artist created each person to say.
What about...
That would be the original. I'm only saying this because I'm thinking of last year I went to see View from the Bridge, the Arthur Miller play. The reinterpretation was fabulous, but it was vastly. I can't even imagine Arthur Miller would have seen what that version that I saw last year was. But the lines were all still the same lines. It was all still the same themes. Mm-hmm. It was just reinterpreted.
I'm just thinking, though, there are a lot of examples of real plays being performed and cutting down language. There's generally people frown on adding in language, but they cut down on it. I mean, I saw the Cherry Orchard recently, and they totally changed the language, and I thought it was terrible. But in Shakespearean plays, they cut down on the language all the time, because when it was performed in the 16th century, the 17th century, whatever, people would sit there all day or for hours and hours and hours and watching these plays. They lasted like 5 or 6 hours. Right. Now you go to see Hamlet and it lasts 2 or 3 hours. So they've cut out a lot of it. And I think we'd still consider it Hamlet, and we'd still consider it worth going to the play and probably prefer that it's not 6 hours. So I don't know if I buy that all the lines have to be.
Or maybe the essence. I mean, and how do you define the essence?
Kind of individual priorities, right? To a historian of plays, one set of performances is closer than others to the artist's original intent, right? But to somebody else, they might have a different kind of appreciation for it.
See, and with the works of Shakespeare, I mean, I'm quite sure that people during Shakespeare's time, if they heard even just the dialogue, they're familiar with the language of that particular time. There's a lot of words that had different meanings and different inflections that if we heard it today, we would totally, unless we're really experts, very well educated in the language, in Elizabethan English, we would miss different kind of puns and different meanings, that was experienced in that time than this time. And again, if you take, suppose you just translate Elizabethan language into more modern language. You know, if you take a work of Macbeth, right, instead of having that particular, you have you put it into more modern language so that, and then, so maybe people could understand it better, you know. Maybe, you know, they would have a better idea, but again, the experience is going to be different.
Just to sort of sum up, I think the direction in which all of these kind of points are tending is that they're going to be all of these extremely kind of like sort of messy features of the way in which these kind of works get realized that might matter much, 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 much more to us about whether or not something is going to count as a performance of that work than any one thing that's in the sort of script or that's in the score is going to be able to allow us to explain. So I think that that's one reason to be at least maybe sort of skeptical that we're going to be able to always tell a very attractive story about the way that the things that Goodman says are constitutive of the work of art sort of dominate the things that are contingent about the work of art, because it's going to be frequently the case that what we're going to care about is going to be the latter, and where some of those things are going to seem more like facts about the work of art even than things that are in the notation. So I think that's important. One thing that I wanted to make sure, how are we doing on time?
3:51.
Oh, so we're almost out. I guess here's a thought that I wanted to maybe make sure that we covered before we ended the meetup. So one thing that's really striking, though, is that whether or not Goodman is right or wrong about the relative contributions of these constitutive features versus these contingent features in defining what the artwork kind of is, in some sort of metaphysical sense it is, he has a view about the way that they're related to each other. Like a view about how the autographic and the allographic are related to each other by kind of a historical necessity. Does anybody remember that point or want to sort of explain like sort of how the autographic and the allographic are related in the kind of process of an art form's development? Anyone go one have a stab?
Well, the autograph depends a lot on the original, its original form, and it and only it can be it. Whereas the allographic can be many different reproductions of that, and still be true to the form.
That's good. That's the correct definition. What was music always allographic? Now it's allographic. We relate to it through these scores, though of course there are all these musical practices like in jazz or improvisation, presumably other like folk musical traditions where remix. Now I have Jay-Z in my head. Thank you. There's a specific historical conjecture here. Actually, Goodman uses some pretty strong language. I think Goodman's a really excellent writer. He uses some pretty strong language to talk about this. He says, I think somewhere, that allographic art has won its emancipation not by proclamation, but by notation. Does somebody want to explain to me what it means to say that allographic art has emancipated itself? Or has been emancipated from something? What's it been emancipated from?
Critics.
No, nothing's emancipated from that.
Well, critics that determine it to be it.
Forgery.
Sure, yeah. It's emancipated from forgery. That's one thing that's emancipated from.
Authority, people who have authoritized the work, people who will
The canon.
proclaim it an original.
Wait, it's emancipated from being called an original, or
No, it's that allographic doesn't need a set of provenances to be shown to be
interesting.
original.
Good. Okay. So it's not going to need to be authenticated in precisely the way that a physical work of art needs to be authenticated. But I want to suggest that there's a limit to, there's a really, really sharp limitation to what Nelson Goodman is suggesting, and it must have been something that he's aware of. So you're aware maybe of these kind of thought experiments. Imagine, monkeys given 1,000 years in a room with a typewriter might write the works of Shakespeare by sheer random accident or whatever. So I think that one thing that's mysteriously missing from the discussion here, which is going to, in some sense, kind of bring some of that structure of the autographic back into the allographic, is going to be this question: is this the text that was written by this specific person or not? Because it's not like we only care about the notation. It's not like if I find out that Middlemarch was written by committee and not by Marianne Evans' pseudonym George Eliot. It's not like I would then be like, do I then say, oh, George Eliot was a committee? Do I say that? Do I find out that this pseudonym that I thought was a pseudonym of this woman, Marianne Evans, with this novel, had a male pseudonym? Do I then say, oh, all that time I was talking about this committee that wrote this piece and collectively, and then, is that the right answer?
No.
Yeah. So here's another metaphysical thesis that I'll leave you with that might, that I think is very related to the discussion we were having earlier about caring not just that we're having a certain experience, caring about what thing in the world is causing that experience, even if we can't tell that matters, is that the origins of even allographic works of art, the origins of plays, the origins of novels, the origins of musical works, are essential to their identity. So a note-by-note piece that was created by somebody else, unbeknownst to Mozart, that's exactly the same symphony as a Mozart symphony, if you were only to look at the pages, is not the symphony by Mozart, right? And this is something that one could sort of contest or argue against. I'm putting this forward as a claim. I want to suggest that works of art are essentially the creations of the specific individuals that made them. And this is just going to have the consequence that we don't merely care about we have to authenticate even a work of notation. We don't have to authenticate performances of a score. We have to authenticate a score vis-a-vis the person that originally made the actual music. So that's this way in which this kind of structure that Goodman was concerned about, that he makes it seem in the second part of the essay, goes away once you change to these things where there's a score or a written version, might still exist even in that case.
But I was thinking as you were speaking, for instance, our appreciation of the Rembrandt, the fake Rembrandt, may change as we realize it's not Rembrandt, right? But would we listen to Beethoven's Fifth in a different way had we known, or had we discovered it's not Beethoven's?
I mean, there are cases like this. So I mean, it's well known that the Mozart it's well known that the Mozart Requiem, the version of it that we have couldn't have possibly been entirely by Mozart. Somebody must have reconstructed the original score that we have. It was not Mozart that completed it. Somebody else completed it based on Mozart's writing. And so there's always this sense that you have when you listen to the Mozart Requiem, like you're constantly sort of, well, the Dies Irae is really good, so probably that's the Mozart part, and this part is less good, so we're going to assume that's not the Mozart part. So you can be put in this kind of, this headspace. I think there are many works of music that have precisely the effect that you're imagining, where if there was some doubt about the authenticity of Beethoven's Fifth, that would factor into our experience of the work. Now Goodman might still be able to keep his distinction between the work and the performance, right, and say that the work is constituted by the score. But then the score bears some further relationship to the person that made it. And that's this
Right.
other dimension of authenticity that still exists even in the case
But
of these
somehow
other art
it's
forms.
more relatable in terms of paintings, in terms of like reading a book that is authored by somebody else, or music. Somehow it's hard to relate to this point.
Let me give you a really quick argument for why it does. So imagine that I write a novel and I use the name like Elena Viramontes or something like that. Imagine that I use a pseudonym. And you can say about me that I'm a shitty writer by saying Viramontes is a shitty writer. But I certainly, in using that name, have induced you to believe that I either am, or I'm presenting myself as, a woman from a Spanish-speaking community, right? And your interpretation of the authority with which I can talk about certain sorts of experiences, and the sense in which I'm giving you insight about something, is going to be very, very mediated by your sense that this is the work of a person with a certain ethnicity, with a certain gender.
Actually, that's true. I read Alexander McCall Smith. I don't know. He writes these books about a little village in Gambia or Namibia or something, as a woman private detective.
Oh,
yeah.
I read that.
I read that, and then I discovered this is a British guy, and I was like, forget it. I'm not reading this book
Such not an
anymore.
old woman.
Matt, it's 4 o'clock. You're welcome to stop if you need
Yeah,
to
that's
stop.
true.
I'm actually going to have to go, but this was a
Okay.
great
Thank you very
discussion.
much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
guys.
Can we do something on Wittgenstein? That would be really nice.
Here? Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching, I mean, my last Wittgenstein class is on Thursday, so it's fresh. I've just been thinking about it.
Maybe the
Um,
next one just.
Yeah, what do you want?
I don't know. I just haven't ever studied him, so it would give me an excuse to read something. That's all. And I just read his comments on Fraser's Golden Bough, and that just like 5 or 6 pages. It was so interesting.
I've never read that text, actually.
Yeah, it's just 5 or 6 pages.
It's funny, because Fraser, like, has this kind of really weird,
Yeah.
like, it's such a weird...
He makes a lot of fun of him, so
Yeah.
it's just.
It's not hard, it's like, you know, it's almost like petty to
Yeah.
make fun of that kind of moment in anthropology that was really speculative, that was really, like, grand. You know, there was this book of literary criticism that I think came out in the 90s by this woman Camille Paglia called Sexual Persona, and one of the things that's all over that text is references
Fraser?
to Fraser.
Oh,
She's
God.
obsessed
Oh,
with him.
cool.
So that's the only reason why I knew about that book from a really young age, because I picked up the Paglia for a very odd reason. There was a copy of Spin magazine that had Fiona Apple on the cover, and for some
There
reason
you go,
they
it's
had
a
a
little
spread in it that was about like a good feminist's bookshelf.
How
And it was
cool.
like, there was this kind of, and it was a little bit offensive because it was like, there was like a bed, it was like literally, like practically on the feminist's like nightstand. But I was like, I want to read some of these books. And that one, well yeah, it was, Sexual Persona was on it, The Second Sex, Betty Friedan, like all of the kind of classics. So I read all of this like feminist stuff when I was in high school because I was trying to like read the stuff that Spin magazine told me to read.
Motivation and tension. I would love you to do Nietzsche.
Thank you so much.
Would you
Sure.
ever?
Yeah, I'll talk to Justine. I'm sure I'll do some more meetups in the
Yeah,
spring.
please send me the information about your class
Yeah.
before it gets to the kids. We have almost 1,000 members.
Oh,
Good for you. Did you start that all yourself?
It's been going for 4 years.
if you
but-
go,
God
they
bless you. Well, it also speaks to our times, I think. I mean, so much of this truth, it's fascinating because it bears witness today. Truth. You know, look at all the fake news.